Heavy scales scraped against the plasteel floor, a sound like dragging concrete blocks across a highway. She was 20 feet of apex predator, a creature built by evolution to crack open starship hulls, but right now she was just a mother begging for a paycheck. Behind the reinforced glass, the payroll clerk laughed. That's when the smell of cheap recaf, ozone, and unwashed fear hit the back of my throat. I didn't step out of line to be a savior. I just wanted the damn screaming to stop. The fluorescent lights in Sector 4's administrative block didn't buzz. They clicked. A rapid, erratic sound like a Geiger counter registering a lethal dose, drilling directly into the space behind my eyes. I rubbed my temples. My fingers came away greasy with sweat and industrial lubricant. I was running on 4 hours of sleep, a violently empty stomach, and a mug of synthesized coffee that tasted like battery acid and burnt copper. All I wanted was my shift differential and a dark bunk. But payday on Orbital Station 89 was never a transaction. It was a hostage negotiation. The line snaked out of the paymaster's office and down the corrugated iron corridor. Mostly humans, dock workers, and welders, standing shoulder to shoulder with a few of the indentured Xenos the company leased for heavy lifting. The air was thick. You could taste the recycled oxygen, heavy with the stench of sulfur, stale sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of anxiety. At the front of the line stood Tess. That wasn't her real name. Her real name was a series of subsonic rumbles and jaw clicks that human vocal cords physically couldn't replicate. The foreman on Dock 6 had called her Tess on her first day, and the name stuck like cheap adhesive. She was a draconian, or at least that's what the corporate pamphlets called her species. She took up half the room. Even hunched over, her spined back scraped the low ceiling tiles, dislodging flakes of asbestos substitute that drifted down onto her crimson scales. She was a mountain of muscle, razor-sharp ridges, and primal lethality. A single swipe of her heavy, clawed forelimb could shear a loading mech in half, yet she was making herself as small as physically possible. Her heavy tail, thick as a pipeline, was curled tight against her hind legs. Her massive head, crowned with 4 swept-back horns, was bowed so low her snout almost touched the grime-slicked floor. "I do not understand," she said. Her voice was synthesized through a rusted translation collar bolted to her thick neck. The machine stripped all emotion from the words, rendering them in a flat, monotone drone, but the physical vibration of her chest told a different story. It was a low, frantic thrumming. The floor plates vibrated beneath my boots. Behind the reinforced plexiglass of the pay booth sat Fletcher. Fletcher was a middle management parasite. He wore a crisp, pressed uniform that smelled of synthetic pine cologne, a scent that cut through the station's grime like a razor blade. He had the soft, pale hands of a man who had never lifted anything heavier than a stylus. "What's not to understand, 8?" Fletcher said, not even looking up from his datapad. He didn't use her nickname, just her asset number. "You didn't hit your quota. Your caloric output exceeded the company allowance, and you caused structural damage to Bay 4 during the hull plating shift. Damages have been deducted from your wages." "I hauled 400 tons of tungsten," Tess rumbled, the translator struggling to keep up with the guttural desperation in her throat. "The harness failed. The harness snapped. I caught the plating with my back so it would not crush the human workers. Equipment failure due to improper use by the operator," Fletcher recited, his voice dripping with bored, rehearsed apathy. He tapped a manicured nail against the glass. Read your contract, 8. The company isn't liable. Your net payout for this cycle is 0. Move along. You're holding up the line. Tess didn't move. The temperature in the room was rising. Draconians radiated heat when distressed. I could feel the wave of thermal energy washing over my face, baking the stagnant air. A thick, smoky scent poured off her scales. Brimstone and raw panic. "Please," she said. The translator clipped the word, a harsh burst of static. "I only need my wages. My children haven't eaten in 3 cycles. They are sick. The cold—" "Not my problem," Fletcher sighed, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. He adjusted his cuffs. "Should have thought about your litter before you dropped 100 tons of company metal. Step aside, or I'm calling station security." She dropped to her knees. The sound of 2 tons of armored flesh hitting the plasteel deck was deafening. The human workers in line flinched, instinctively stepping back. It was a deeply unnatural sight. A creature that belonged at the top of a food chain. A beast that looked like it had crawled out of a mythology book, kneeling in the dirt before a smirking accountant in a sterile box. Tess pressed her massive, scaled hands against the plexiglass. Her claws, thick as combat knives, scraped uselessly against the reinforced surface. "Please," she repeated. The translator sparked, a tiny wisp of smoke curling from the collar. Her actual voice bled through, a high-pitched, keening whine that sounded like a massive dog caught in a steel trap. "My children, just half, just enough for the protein paste. Please." Fletcher smiled. It was a tiny, wet, satisfied smile. He was enjoying it. He liked the power. He liked watching a monster beg. "Security," Fletcher said, pressing a button on his console. "We have a non-compliant asset in the Sector 4 pay line." I looked down at my coffee. The brown liquid rippled from the vibrations of her crying. My head pounded. I had an engine to rebuild at 600. I didn't care about the Draconian. I didn't care about alien babies. I was just a dock foreman trying to scrape by. But I looked at Fletcher's smug, shiny face, and something cold and ugly snapped in my chest. I dumped my coffee into the nearest trash receptacle. I shoved past a couple of welders who grumbled but shut up when they saw my face. My boots hit the floor plates with heavy, deliberate thuds. I didn't stop until I was standing right beside Tess. The heat radiating off her was oppressive, like standing in front of an open blast furnace. She flinched as I approached, a massive armored beast cowering from a 5'10" human in grease-stained coveralls. I ignored her. I stepped right up to the plexiglass and slammed the flat of my palm against it. Hard. The glass rattled in its frame. Fletcher jumped, his hand darting away from the security console. "Logan," Fletcher snapped, recovering his composure, though his pale cheeks flushed pink. "What the hell are you doing? Get back in line." "Cancel the security call, Fletcher," I said. My voice was quiet. I didn't shout. Shouting was for people who were out of control. I was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." I leaned closer to the glass. "Cancel the call and issue Asset 8, her full cycle pay. Now." Fletcher let out a short, incredulous laugh. He looked at the line of workers behind me, seeking solidarity, but everyone had suddenly found the ceiling tiles incredibly interesting. "Are you drunk, Logan?" She damaged company property. It's in the bylaws. Section 4, Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Corporate Labor Code explicitly states that equipment failure resulting from poor maintenance is the liability of the shift supervisor, I recited, staring dead into his watery blue eyes. I was the shift supervisor on Bay 4 yesterday. I signed the requisition forms for new harnesses 3 weeks ago. You denied them. I have the digital receipts time-stamped on my console. Fletcher's smile vanished. That's irrelevant. The structural damage was mitigated by Asset 8. I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave. If she hadn't caught that plating, it would have crushed Hammond and 2 other union mechanics. You want to dock her pay? Fine. I'll log the incident with the union rep. I'll report an OSHA violation for forcing workers to use condemned gear. I'll have the labor board down here breathing down your neck so hard you'll smell their lunch. And then, Fletcher, I will personally tell the Dock 6 union boys that you're the reason they aren't getting hazard pay this month. Fletcher swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. The Dock 6 union wasn't a group you crossed. They had a habit of tossing scabs into the waste recyclers. You can't do that, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Watch me. I pulled my datapad from my belt and tapped the screen to life. I'm opening the comms channel to the rep right now. You've got 5 seconds to punch her numbers. Tess shifted beside me. Her massive head turned, one giant slit-pupiled eye focusing on me. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Fletcher. 5, I said. You're making a mistake, Logan. The regional manager will hear about this. 4. She's just a beast. You're throwing away your pension for a lizard. 3. Fletcher glared at me, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. He slammed his fingers down on his keypad, typing furiously. Fine, fine. You want to take responsibility for this thing? Be my guest. The terminal on the outside of the glass chimed. A small slot word, spitting out a rectangular cred chit. I snatched it before it could fall. I checked the balance. Full wages, 600 credits. Barely enough to keep a human fed for a month, let alone a creature her size. Fletcher leaned forward, his voice a venomous hiss through the speaker grill. You've painted a target on your back, Logan. Don't think I'll forget this. I'm counting on it, I said. I turned away from the booth. Tess was still on her knees, staring at me. The heat pouring off her had changed. It was less frantic, more steady. The smell of brimstone was fading, replaced by a sharp metallic scent, like rain on hot pavement. I held out the cred chit. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at the small plastic card, then up at my face. Her mechanical translator crackled. Why? Take it, I said gruffly, shoving it toward her. Before I change my mind and use it to buy a decent bottle of whiskey. She reached out with a trembling forelimb. 2 of her massive talons pinched the tiny card with surprising delicacy, lifting it from my palm without leaving a scratch on my skin. Get up, I muttered, suddenly hyper-aware of the dozen sets of eyes watching us. You're blocking the line. Tess slowly rose to her feet, her joints popping like gunfire. She clutched the chit to her chest. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes was heavy, weighted with an exhaustion I understood all too well. She turned and began to lumber down the corridor. I stood there for a second, rubbing the bridge of my nose. The headache was coming back. I looked at the line, realizing I still hadn't gotten my own pay. I turned back to the glass. Fletcher was glaring at me. "Process my slip, Fletcher," I said. "Take a number," he spat. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. I just grabbed my slip, shoved it into my pocket, and walked away. I needed sleep. But as I walked down the hall, following the deep gouges Tess's claws had left in the floorboards, a nagging sensation chewed at the back of my mind. The corporate goons didn't like losing. Fletcher wouldn't just let a xenobiological worker walk away with 600 credits after a public humiliation. He'd send station security to shake her down in the lower corridors. I stopped. I cursed loudly, a string of profanity that echoed off the metal walls. I turned and followed the dragon. I found her in the bowels of the station, down in Sector 12. This was the undisputed underbelly of Orbital 89. The environmental controls barely reached down here. The air was frigid, thick with condensation that dripped from exposed pipes and pooled on the grating beneath my boots. It smelled of stagnant water, decaying rust, and the sour rot of cheap nutrient paste. The lights were mostly blown, leaving long stretches of the corridor cast in suffocating darkness. I moved quietly, keeping a distance, but tracking her wasn't hard. You don't lose a 20-foot reptile in a tight corridor. I just followed the lingering heat signature and the deep, rhythmic thud of her footsteps. She stopped at a massive, blast-reinforced bulkhead door that had been permanently wedged open with a rusted support beam. It led into a decommissioned cargo hold. I crept up to the edge of the doorframe and peered inside. The hold was massive, cold, and dark, lit only by a single flickering emergency lumen in the far corner. But the darkness was broken by a dull, pulsing orange glow near the center of the room. It was a nest. It wasn't made of twigs or leaves. It was constructed from shredded thermal blankets, twisted rebar, discarded fiberglass insulation, and the husks of dead maintenance drones. It was a makeshift fortress, built to trap whatever meager heat the station's exhaust pipes bled through the walls. Tess stepped into the center of the nest. She let out a low, crooning sound, a vibration that I felt in my teeth rather than heard. From the pile of scrap, 3 shapes shifted. They were hatchlings. They were maybe the size of large dogs, but they looked wrong. Their proportions were stretched, their limbs spindly and weak. Their scales, which should have been a vibrant, healthy color like their mother's, were a dull, ashy gray, flaking off in dry patches. They moved with a jerky, lethargic weakness that made my stomach twist. They didn't swarm her. They barely managed to lift their heavy heads, letting out weak, rattling hisses. Tess dropped to her belly, wrapping her massive tail around the nest to form a barricade. She nudged the closest hatchling with her snout. The translator collar clicked on. "I have it," she whispered. The mechanical voice was eerie in the silence of the cargo hold. "I have the credits. We will eat today. The warm food." I leaned against the cold metal of the bulkhead. I felt sick. The corporation wasn't just underpaying them. They were starving them out. It was a calculated metric. Keep the workers hungry enough to be desperate, weak enough to be compliant, but just fed enough to pull a 10-hour shift. If Tess lost her temper and crushed Fletcher, station security would put her down, and the hatchlings would freeze. She knew it. The company knew it. I pulled a cigarette from my pocket. Contraband on the station, but down here, no one cared. I stuck it between my lips, but didn't light it. I just chewed on the filter. Suddenly, The rusted floor grate behind me shrieked. I spun around, my hand instinctively dropping to the heavy titanium wrench clipped to my belt. 2 men stood in the shadows of the corridor. They wore the gray fatigues of station security, but they were missing their badges. One of them held a stun baton, the electric current arcing with a sharp blue crackle. The other held a heavy-duty kinetic shotgun, the barrel resting casually over his shoulder. They were Fletcher's problem solvers, the guys you sent down to Sector 12 to mug an alien and make it look like a tragic turf dispute. "Well, well," the one with the stun baton said, stepping into the dim light. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow. "Look who it is, Foreman Logan. You're a long way from the officer's mess, buddy." I didn't draw the wrench, not yet. I just stared at them, shifting my weight so I was standing directly in the middle of the doorway, blocking their line of sight to the cargo hold. "Wrong floor, boys," I said, my voice flat. "The maintenance shafts are flooded. Turn around." The guy with the shotgun chuckled. He racked the slide. The metallic clack-clack echoed loudly in the damp corridor. "We ain't here for maintenance, Logan. Fletcher says there's a rogue asset down here. Stole some company credits. We're just doing a retrieval." "Fletcher made a clerical error," I said. I spat the unlit cigarette onto the wet floor. "The credits belong to her. You boys can go back up and tell him to write it off." "Or what?" Scarface sneered, tapping the baton against his thigh. "You gonna file a grievance on us too? Down here, nobody gives a rat's ass about union bylaws, Foreman. Now step aside, or we'll bag you up with the lizard." Behind me, in the dark, I heard the slow, heavy shifting of metal. A low, subsonic growl began to vibrate through the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling. The temperature in the corridor immediately spiked. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the 2 guards. Their smug expressions faltered. Scarface took a half step backward. The shotgun lowered just a fraction of an inch. I pulled the heavy titanium wrench from my belt. The metal was cold and solid in my grip. "You don't want to do this," I told them. I wasn't trying to sound tough. I was stating a mathematical fact. "She's a mother. She's cornered. And I am very, very tired." The heavy blast door behind me creaked. The orange glow of the emergency lumen was blocked out as an immense shadow rose up to fill the doorway. A blast of hot air, smelling of burning sulfur and raw ozone, washed over my back. 2 massive, slit-pupiled eyes, glowing like fresh coals, ignited in the darkness just over my shoulder. "Leave him!" the mechanical translator boomed. The flat voice couldn't hide the primal, deafening roar beneath it. I looked at Scarface. "I suggest you run," I said, "because if she doesn't kill you, I'm going to take that baton and shove it so far up your exhaust port you'll be coughing sparks." The guards didn't hesitate. They broke. They turned and sprinted back up the corridor, their boots splashing loudly in the puddles, slipping on the slick grating in their desperation to get away. I watched them go until the darkness swallowed them. I let out a long, shaky breath and holstered the wrench. The adrenaline drained out of me, leaving me feeling hollow and exhausted. I turned around. Tess was looming over me. Her teeth, each the size of a combat knife, were bared in a terrifying grimace. But as the guards disappeared, she slowly lowered her head, the heat radiating from her dialed back. "You followed me," she said, the translator clicking. "Yeah, I figured Fletcher would send a welcoming committee." I reached into my other pocket and pulled out my personal ration card. I tossed it onto the deck in front of her. "There's another 100 credits on that. Buy them something with calcium. Their scales look like crap. She stared at the card. Then she looked at me. I cannot repay this. I don't want you to, I muttered, turning to walk away. Just keep your head down, 8. Tess, she said. I stopped. The humans on the dock. They call me Tess. I looked back over my shoulder. She was standing in the doorway, a hulking beast of burden, framed by the grim reality of a starvation cage. But she wasn't just an asset anymore. Logan, I said. See you on the docks, Tess. As I walked back up to the civilized levels, the cold logic of what I had just done settled in. I had assaulted a payroll officer. I had threatened corporate security. I had just declared war on the most powerful entity on the station, all for a creature that could bite me in half. I was going to get fired. I was probably going to get killed. I smiled. It was a tired, ugly smile, but it was there. Let them come. My alarm went off at 0400 hours. It wasn't a chime or a beep. It was a violent, vibrating buzz that rattled the cheap metal frame of my bunk. I slapped the console to kill it, staring up at the condensation dripping from the low ceiling. My mouth tasted like stale copper and old regrets. I didn't want to get up. My shoulders throbbed from the tension of the previous day, and my knuckles were stiff. I laid there in the dark, listening to the deep, mechanical heartbeat of Orbital 89. A low, continuous rumbling vibrated through the bulkheads, the life support scrubbers fighting a losing battle against the station's decay. I fully expected to find a termination notice blinking on my terminal. Assaulting corporate security and extorting a payroll officer wasn't exactly standard operating procedure for a dock foreman. I braced myself, tapped the screen, and waited for the red text of a firing squad. Nothing, just my standard shift roster, glowing in dull green text. But the location had changed. I wasn't on Dock 6 anymore. Reassignment. External plasma conduit maintenance. Sector 7G. The kiln. A cold knot formed in my gut, heavy and tight. Fletcher hadn't fired me. Firing a union man required paperwork, hearings, and a payout. It invited scrutiny. Reassigning a union man to the most lethal environment on the station? That was just administrative reshuffling. Sector 7G hadn't been serviced by a biological crew in 6 months because the radiation shielding was shot. If an automated drone couldn't fix it, the company usually just let it rot until it became critical. If I refused the assignment, I was in breach of contract, and I forfeited my pension. If I went, I'd probably be incinerated by a microfracture in a thermal pipe. It was a neat, legally binding execution. I scrolled down to my crew list. There was only one name. Asset number 8. I swore loudly, the sound deadened by the thin, foam-lined walls of my quarters. Fletcher was killing 2 birds with 1 plasma leak. By the time I reached the airlock for Sector 7G, the smell of burning ozone was already thick enough to make my eyes water. The corridor leading to the access hatch was stripped of all the usual corporate propaganda posters. Down here, the walls were scorched black, blistered from ambient heat. Tess was already waiting. She looked different today. The hunched, defeated posture was gone. She sat back on her massive hind legs, her thick tail resting heavily on the grated floor. The dull, ashy gray of her scales had receded slightly, replaced by a deeper, healthier crimson sheen. Her children had eaten. The calcium supplements were already working. She wore a heavy industrial tool harness strapped across her broad chest, loaded with plasma torches, spanners the size of my leg, and coils of conductive wire. "They sent you here too," she said. The mechanical click of her translator echoed in the empty, sweltering corridor. "Yeah, looks like we got the VIP suite," I muttered, double-checking the seals on my hazardous environment suit. The suit was bulky, restrictive, and smelled like the sweat of the 3 dead guys who had worn it before me. I locked my helmet into place and grabbed my heavy diagnostic tablet. I looked up at her. She wasn't wearing a hazard suit. The company didn't make them in draconian sizes. "The ambient heat in the conduit is going to hit 140 degrees Fahrenheit, I warned her, my voice amplified through my helmet's external speakers. "And there's background radiation. It's a death trap, Tess. You don't have to go in there. If you log a medical refusal, if I refuse, they dock my wages. My children will starve again." She stood up, her massive head brushing the low ceiling. The heat radiating off her own body seemed to push back against the sweltering air of the corridor. "My kind were forged in the volcanic belts of Draconis Prime. Your heat does not frighten me, Logan." I stared at her for a long second. It was the first time she had used my name. It sounded strange coming through the sterile, robotic filter of her collar. "All right," I said, punching the access code into the bulkhead keypad. "But keep your head down. If a primary coolant line blows, your volcanic biology isn't going to stop you from turning into soup." The massive blast doors groaned open, and a wall of heat hit me so hard it physically pushed me backward. It was like opening the door to a blast furnace. The air inside the kiln wasn't just hot, it was angry. It shimmered with thermal distortion, turning the massive intertwining pipes and valves into a blurry, hellish landscape. I stepped over the threshold, my boots sticking to the semi-melted floor sealant. "Let's get to work." For 3 hours, we didn't speak. The roar of superheated plasma rushing through the primary veins of the station drowned out any possibility of casual conversation. The work was brutal, mindless agony. My hazmat suit's internal cooling system was failing, blowing lukewarm air over my face that only smeared the sweat around. My muscles cramped, screaming in protest every time I wrestled with a rusted pressure valve. Tess was a machine. I watched her through the hazy, orange-tinted visor of my helmet. She hauled 2-ton replacement manifolds up vertical access shafts without breaking a sweat, her massive claws sinking into the reinforced steel walls for purchase. Where I needed a hydraulic jack to pry open a warped access panel, she just slipped her fingers under the edge and ripped it back with a horrific screech of tearing metal. There was a brutal poetry to the way she moved. She wasn't just strong, she understood the mechanics of leverage and pressure. She was an apex predator, forced to use her evolutionary gifts to fix plumbing. It felt profoundly wrong, but I couldn't deny it was keeping us alive. We were working on Junction 4, deep in the belly of the conduit. I was suspended in a 0G harness, recalibrating a series of magnetic containment seals on a primary artery. Tess was directly below me, holding a massive section of lead shielding in place while I welded the seams. My vision blurred. The sweat in my eyes stung, and my hands were shaking. I was running purely on adrenaline and spite. "Seal 3 is green," I gasped over the local comms channel. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. "Moving to Seal 4. Keep that shielding steady, Tess. The magnetic flux down here is insane." "It is steady," her mechanical voice replied in my ear. I reached for the next valve. My gloved hand slipped. The glove was slick with industrial grease. My wrench skidded off the nut and slammed hard into the digital control housing of the pressure regulator. A sharp, electric crack echoed over the roar of the machinery. A red warning light on the pipe violently flashed to life. Warning, containment breach. It happened in a fraction of a second. The pressure regulator blew. It didn't explode with fire. It ruptured with a deafening shriek, firing a concentrated jet of superheated, pressurized steam straight out of the pipe. It was a knife blade of white-hot vapor, capable of cutting through plasteel armor. It was aimed directly at my chest. I froze. My brain registered the threat, but my exhausted muscles simply couldn't move fast enough. I saw the white steam erupt, and I braced for the feeling of my suit boiling away. A massive crimson blur slammed into me. Tess dropped the lead shielding and lunged upward. She hit me with her shoulder, a calculated strike that shattered my harness clips and sent me spinning backward through the zero-G environment. As I tumbled away, I saw the jet of superheated steam strike her broad, armored back. The sound was horrifying. It was the sharp, wet sizzle of meat hitting a hot grill, amplified 100 times. Tess didn't scream. She let out a low, ragged, choking hiss that vibrated through the metal grating. She slammed her hands against the ruptured pipe, throwing her sheer body weight against the hole to stem the flow. The steam shrieked, billowing around her, obscuring her in a thick, boiling cloud. "Tess!" I yelled, scrambling to orient myself. I slammed my magnetic boots against the nearest wall, anchoring myself, and ripped the emergency shutoff lever on the master console. The heavy clank of a blast door falling into place echoed down the conduit. The flow of steam sputtered, choked, and died. I scrambled down the scaffolding, ignoring the burning heat of the metal under my hands. I dropped to the floor beside her. She was slumped against the pipes. The air around her smelled sickeningly of scorched sulfur and cooked flesh. "Don't move," I ordered, my voice cracking. I ripped the med kit from my belt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the clasps. I looked at her back. The thick, overlapping crimson scales, built to deflect micrometeorites and predator claws, had been flash-boiled. A patch the size of a manhole cover was blackened, curled at the edges, and weeping a thick, translucent blue fluid. Draconian blood. "I am functional," she rasped. Her translator sparked, the collar having taken some collateral heat. The robotic voice stuttered, layering her actual guttural groans over the English words. "It is a shallow burn. Shut up," I snapped. I popped the cap off a massive canister of industrial biofoam. It was meant to seal hull breaches and stabilize trauma in human workers. I had no idea what it would do to a reptile. "This is going to hurt. Brace." I sprayed the thick, expanding blue foam directly onto the weeping wound. Tess flinched, her massive claws gouging deep grooves into the plasteel floor plating. She clamped her jaws shut, a low, agonizing rumble vibrating in her throat. But she didn't thrash. She took the pain with a stoicism that made my stomach churn. "You stupid beast," I whispered, the fear slowly giving way to a burning, white-hot anger. Not at her, at Fletcher, at the company. "Why did you do that? You could have been cut in half." She turned her head slowly. Her slit pupil dilated in the dim emergency lighting. "You gave me the credits," she said, simply, the translator clicking softly. "My hatchlings have warm food, a life for a life. It is the law of the clutch. I stared at her. There was no poetry in her eyes, no grand heroic intent. It was simple, primal mathematics. I had fed her young. She had shielded my life. A transaction. But as I looked at the blistered, ruined scales on her back, it didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like a debt I could never repay. I sat back on my heels, wiping a greasy glove across my visor. Fletcher had tried to kill us. He had sent us down here, hoping I'd make a mistake, hoping the station's decay would do his dirty work. He almost won. "Can you stand?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. Tess shifted, testing her muscles. The biofoam had hardened into a rigid protective shell over the burn. "Yes, I can stand." "Good." I stood up, grabbing my heavy titanium spanner. "Because our shift is over, and we have an appointment." The air in the lower levels of Sector 2 always smelled like stale yeast, cheap tobacco, and engine grease. It was the domain of the dock workers, a place where the corporate security teams rarely ventured unless they were heavily armed and traveling in packs. I pushed through the rusted blast doors of the Rusty Piston, the undisputed headquarters of the local union chapter. The bar was dimly lit, the ceiling stained yellow from years of synthesized smoke. A low murmur of exhausted conversation stopped for a fraction of a second as I walked in, then slowly resumed when they recognized my coveralls. I walked straight to the back booth. Donovan was sitting there, nursing a warm glass of synthetic amber ale. He was a mountain of a man, built like a brick wall with a gray beard and a synthetic left eye that glowed a dull, unblinking crimson. He was the chief union representative for Orbital 89, a man who had fought the company in the great strikes of 21 and still had the shrapnel scars to prove it. He didn't look up as I slid into the booth opposite him. "You look like hell, Logan," Donovan rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. He took a slow sip of his ale. "Heard Fletcher put you in the kiln. Half the dock was taking bets on whether you'd come out a cinder." "I survived," I said, my voice flat. "Barely. The Draconian took a blast of primary coolant meant for me. She's in the med bay down in Sector 12, patching up a third-degree thermal burn with duct tape and spit because the company clinic won't treat non-human assets." Donovan sighed, setting his glass down. He finally looked at me. His good eye was exhausted. "What do you want me to do, Logan? Send Fletcher a strongly worded email? You brought this on yourself. You humiliated a company officer in front of a pay line. You painted the target on your own back." "I'm not here for sympathy, Donovan." I pulled my heavy diagnostic tablet from my belt and slammed it onto the sticky table. The screen illuminated, casting a harsh blue light over his scarred face. "I'm here to file a Section 8 grievance. Attempted murder via hazardous reassignment." Donovan stared at the tablet, then let out a bitter, barking laugh. "Section 8? Are you out of your mind? You can't prove intent. Management has the right to reassign personnel based on operational needs. They'll bury you in arbitration for a decade." "Look at the telemetry data," I growled, tapping the screen. I wasn't backing down. I leaned across the table, invading his space. "Look at it. Sector 7G. The radiation baffles were pulled 3 months ago. The thermal regulators were bypassed. The ambient pressure was running at 200% of the safety threshold. That wasn't a maintenance job, Donovan. That was a disposal unit." Donovan picked up the tablet. His synthetic eye whirred, the lens clicking as he scanned the data lines. His jaw tightened. The cynicism in his face cracked, just for a second, replaced by a deep, familiar anger. "This is bad," he muttered. "This is gross negligence." "It's not negligence. It's a message," I said, keeping my voice low. "Fletcher is testing the waters. If he can send a Union foreman and a leased asset into a lethal zone and write it off as an accident, what stops him from doing it to Miller, or Hammond, or you? The company wants to break the hazard pay contracts. They want to see what they can get away with." Donovan set the tablet down. He rubbed his temples, his thick, calloused fingers tracing the edge of his mechanical eye. "The Xeno, Asset 8. You're doing this for her." "I'm doing this because I'm tired of watching people get ground into paste so some suit on Earth can buy a third yacht," I lied. It was only a half lie. I was doing it because of the smell of scorched scales. I was doing it because a starving mother had taken a bullet for me, and the universe hadn't cared. "If I take this to the regional board," Donovan said slowly, "they'll stall. They'll lock us out. They'll cut life support to the lower levels to freeze us out." "Then we don't go to the board," I said. My heart was pounding, a heavy rhythmic thud against my ribs. I was crossing a line I could never uncross. "We go to the docks." Donovan went perfectly still. He looked at me, a long, calculating stare. "A wildcat strike. You're talking about a complete shutdown. Sabotage." "I'm talking about leverage," I replied. "Fletcher only understands bottom lines. We shut down the loading bays. We barricade the primary transit hubs. Nothing comes on the station. Nothing leaves. Not a single pound of ore, not a single drop of fuel until Fletcher is removed, the Draconian gets her hazard pay, and the safety protocols are locked in. They will send the corporate marine detachment, Logan. People will bleed." "People are already bleeding, Donovan. She is bleeding." I slammed my fist onto the table. The glasses rattled. A few heads turned in the bar, but quickly looked away. I lowered my voice, forcing the anger back down. "We outnumber security 20-1. We have the heavy lifters, and we have Tess." "Tess?" "The Draconian," I said. "You want to see what happens when a 20-foot apex predator decides she's had enough of the corporate grind?" Donovan stared at his beer for a long time. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the station's engines beneath our feet, the lifeblood of the corporation. Finally, Donovan reached out and turned off the tablet screen, plunging the table back into the dim, smoky light. "Get your people," Donovan rumbled. He picked up his glass and drained the rest of his ale in one swallow. "I'll call the shift bosses. We hit the main power relays at 0600. And Logan?" I stood up, securing the tablet to my belt. "Yeah?" "Tell the beast to bring her heavy tools," Donovan said, a grim, jagged smile touching the corner of his mouth. "We're going to need to break some doors." At 0600 hours, Orbital 89 didn't wake up. It died. I stood in the primary junction of Docking Bay 4, my hand resting on the master breaker switch. The steel lever was cold and greasy. I pushed it down. Deep in the bowels of the station, the massive rhythmic thud of the cargo conveyors sputtered, groaned, and ground to a violent halt. A second later, the overhead fluorescent light snapped off. The darkness lasted only a heartbeat before the emergency lumens kicked in, bathing the massive bay in a harsh, bloody red. Silence rushed into the void left by the machinery. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. I swallowed hard. The metallic taste of adrenaline and stale coffee flooded the back of my throat. I had just crippled a multi-billion credit logistics hub. There was no going back to the barracks after this. "Weld it!" Donovan's voice shattered the quiet, a gravelly bark that echoed off the high corrugated ceiling. Around the perimeter of the bay, 30 dock workers moved with desperate, practiced efficiency. Sparks rained down like erratic fireworks as plasma torches bit into the heavy blast doors. Hammond, a short guy with permanent grease stains etched into his wrinkles, was fusing the locking mechanisms of the primary transit hub. The smell of charged ozone, melting steel, and panicked sweat filled the stifling air. "We have maybe 20 minutes before Caldwell and the corporate Marines realize this isn't a localized grid failure," Donovan muttered, walking up beside me. He racked a heavy slug thrower, the metallic clack loud in the empty bay. He didn't look at me. His synthetic eye whirred, scanning the dark corners of the dock. "You sure about this, Logan? Once those torches finish, we are officially domestic terrorists." "I was a terrorist the moment I asked for hazard pay," I replied, wiping a bead of sweat from my nose. My hand was trembling. I shoved it deep into the pocket of my coveralls so Donovan wouldn't see. "They'll starve us out before they negotiate. Then we make sure they can't afford to wait." Donovan nodded toward the massive cargo crates stacked in the center of the bay. "That's 3,000 tons of unrefined zero-point fuel. If those shipping freighters don't leave by cycle's end, the company defaults on their government contracts. The penalty fees will bankrupt the sector." The floor suddenly shuddered. It wasn't a mechanical vibration. It was a heavy, rhythmic impact. Thud, thud, thud. The welders stopped. Hammond killed his torch, plunging his section of the wall back into red-tinged shadows. The dock workers nervously reached for heavy spanners, hydrospades, and crowbars, their eyes darting toward the secondary maintenance tunnel. From the darkness of the tunnel, a massive shape emerged. Tess stepped into the red emergency light. She looked like a nightmare dredged up from the bottom of an ocean. The blue industrial biofoam I had sprayed on her back had hardened into a jagged, rigid carapace over her blistered scales. She wore the heavy canvas tool harness, but she wasn't carrying spanners or plasma cutters. She was dragging a 20-foot structural I-beam in her left claw like a baseball bat. The dock workers instinctively backed away. They had worked alongside leased assets for years, but always behind reinforced glass, always under the watchful eye of a shock collar. Seeing a draconian loose, armed and uncollared, sent a primal, evolutionary spike of terror straight into the human brain. Tess didn't look at them. She zeroed in on me. The heat radiating off her was immense, a dry, baking wave that washed over the cold metal of the bay. She stopped 3 feet away, the heavy I-beam scraping against the floor plating. Her mechanical translator collar let out a burst of static. "My hatchlings are secured in the deep vents," she rumbled. "The cold will not reach them. I am here." "You shouldn't be walking," I said, eyeing the rigid blue foam on her back. A few fresh drops of translucent blood wept from the edges where the hardened shell pulled against her skin. "That burn needs sterile wrapping. It needs a reckoning," she corrected. She shifted her weight, and the floor plates groaned. She looked past me, fixing her massive slit-pupiled eyes on the primary blast doors. "They are coming." I didn't hear it at first. Then, Beneath the ringing in my ears, I caught it. The synchronized heavy march of magnetic boots on the steel grating of the outer corridor. It was a sterile, disciplined sound. Corporate Marines. "Positions!" Donovan roared, vaulting over a stack of empty supply crates. "Nobody shoots first. If they want this bay, make them break their teeth on it." I pulled my titanium wrench from my belt. It felt pathetically light. I looked up at the towering, bruised, and burned monster standing beside me. "Stay behind the fuel crates," I told her, my voice tight. "Their kinetic rifles will punch right through that foam." Tess let out a low hiss, a sound like tires spinning in wet gravel. She didn't move. "I do not hide behind the small, Logan." The blast door didn't open. It exploded. A shaped breaching charge blew the locking mechanism outward in a shower of white-hot shrapnel. The concussive wave hit me in the chest like a physical punch, knocking the breath from my lungs and throwing me back against a pallet of nutrient paste. Through the thick, acrid smoke of the blast, high-intensity tactical strobe lights pierced the gloom. They flickered at a nauseating frequency designed to blind and disorient. "By order of the regional board, lay down your weapons," a voice boomed through an amplified bullhorn. It was Caldwell, the chief of station security. "You are in violation of contract. Disperse immediately, or lethal force is authorized." Nobody moved. The dock workers were huddled behind the heavy shipping containers, their knuckles white as they gripped their tools. We were a bunch of tired, underpaid mechanics facing down 30 heavily armored corporate thugs carrying assault rifles. The math was brutally simple. "I repeat, drop your—" Donovan didn't let him finish. "Eat slag, Caldwell," he bellowed from behind a forklift. "We aren't moving until the board acknowledges the Section 8. Through the settling smoke, I saw the sleek black polyceramic armor of the Marines. They didn't look human. They looked like mass-produced insects. The front line locked heavy riot shields together, forming an impenetrable wall of synthetic glass and steel. Behind them, a dozen rifles were raised, the red laser sights cutting through the dust and settling on our makeshift barricades. "Clear the bay," Caldwell ordered. His voice was bored. He wasn't negotiating. He was doing extermination work. The sharp thwack of tear gas canisters firing echoed in the bay. 3 heavy metal cylinders arced over the shield wall, clattering onto the deck. Thick gray smoke began to violently hiss from the vents, instantly burning my eyes and grabbing my throat like a pair of rough hands. Someone to my left, Hammond, started coughing violently, stumbling out from cover. "Hammond, get down!" I yelled, my eyes streaming. 2 red lasers snapped to Hammond's chest. The mechanical clack of a rifle firing cut through the hiss of the gas. Hammond dropped, screaming, clutching his shattered thigh. The sight of human blood on the deck broke the stalemate. It wasn't a standoff anymore. "Fire!" Donovan roared, unloading his slug thrower. The heavy rounds sparked harmlessly against the Marines' riot shields, leaving nothing but shallow dents. The Marines advanced in a synchronized, unhurried march. They were going to sweep the room, break our bones, and drag the survivors to the holding cells. Then, the air in the room changed. The tear gas swirling around me was suddenly sucked upward, caught in a massive thermal updraft. The temperature in the bay spiked violently, soaring from a cold chill to a suffocating, blistering heat in 3 seconds. Tess moved. She didn't charge blindly. She exploded forward with a terrifying, calculated velocity, dropping to all fours. Her massive claws dug into the metal floor, ripping up chunks of plasteel as she built momentum. The sheer mass of her 20-foot frame displaced the air, creating a shockwave that blew the tear gas away. The Marines froze. Discipline gave way to panic. You can train a man to shoot a rioter, but you can't train him to stand his ground against a living freight train of scale and muscle. "Target the beast! Target the beast!" Caldwell screamed, his composed facade shattering. Rifles erupted. Tracers lit up the bay like a strobe light. Sparks flew off Tess's crimson scales. A few kinetic rounds embedded themselves in the thick blue biofoam on her back, but she didn't even flinch. She hit the shield wall at 30 miles an hour. The impact sounded like a commercial shuttle crashing. The unbreakable wall of riot shields shattered like cheap glass. 5 armored Marines were thrown backward through the air, screaming as their limbs tangled. Tess didn't stop to bite or tear. She simply used her momentum, sliding her massive shoulder into the breached line, scattering the security force like bowling pins. She swung her tail, thick as a pipeline and heavy as an anvil. It swept the floor, catching 3 Marines in the chest and sweeping them off their feet with a sickening crunch of shattered body armor. Caldwell backpedaled, his sidearm drawn, firing wildly at her head. A round grazed her jaw, drawing a thin line of bright blue blood. Tess let out a roar. It wasn't a sound processed through her mechanical collar. It was the raw, unfiltered voice of a draconian. It was a subsonic frequency that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the chest cavity. The emergency lumens flickered and shattered overhead, raining glass down on the deck. She reached out, grabbed Caldwell by the chest plate of his pristine black armor, and lifted him off the ground with one hand. He dropped his gun. He kicked his legs, gasping for air, looking like a helpless child suspended in the grip of a nightmare. Tess brought her massive face close to his, her hot, sulfurous breath washing over his helmet. The remaining Marines, scattered and bruised, dropped their weapons. They weren't paid enough to fight a dragon. Silence rushed back into the bay, save for the crackle of localized fires and Hammond's ragged breathing. I pushed myself off the deck, coughing the last of the gas from my lungs, my ribs aching. I walked past the surrendered Marines, stepping over their discarded rifles, and stopped beside Tess. She was looking at me, holding the commander of station security in the air. Her chest heaved with exertion. The blue blood was dripping steadily from her jaw, hitting the metal floor with soft, wet splatters. "Do I break him?" The mechanical translator clicked, its sterile voice completely at odds with the violent scene. I looked up at Caldwell. His eyes were wide, terrified, pleading behind his shattered visor. I tasted the blood in my mouth. I wanted to say yes. God, I wanted to say yes. "No," I rasped, wiping the sweat and soot from my face. "Drop him. He's just a middleman." Tess opened her claws. Caldwell hit the deck like a sack of wet cement. He scrambled backward, gasping. I pulled my comms link from my belt and keyed the emergency frequency for the executive deck. The line connected with a sharp beep. "This is Foreman Logan," I said into the receiver, my voice steady, echoing in the quiet bay. "The security detachment is neutralized. Dock 4 is secured. Nothing moves until you put Regional Manager Davis on the line." 30 minutes later, the executive transport elevator pinged. I stood at the edge of the bay. Tess was seated heavily behind me, licking the graze on her jaw, her massive bulk casting a long, jagged shadow. Donovan was tending to Hammond's leg with a med kit. The elevator doors slid open, revealing Regional Manager Davis. He wasn't wearing armor. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that smelled faintly of real lavender, a luxury I hadn't smelled in 5 years. He looked completely out of place, standing amidst the smoke, shattered glass, and bleeding men. Beside him, looking pale, sweating, and significantly smaller than I remembered, was Fletcher. Davis walked forward, his expensive leather shoes stepping delicately over a puddle of coolant. He didn't look at the Marines groaning on the floor. He didn't look at Tess. He looked directly at me. "Foreman Logan," Davis said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of emotion. "You have cost the Wayland-Taney Corporation approximately 4 million credits in delayed shipping fees over the last hour. I am here to ensure that number does not reach 5. "You know what we want," I said, leaning against my wrench. My legs felt like lead. "Full hazard pay for the Sector 7 teams, real radiation shielding, and full union contract rights for all indentured Xeno assets on the station, including proper caloric stipends." Davis adjusted his cuffs. "The union demands are acceptable. We have already drafted the addendums. The Xeno asset modifications, however, represent a permanent overhead increase of 12%. The board will not authorize that. Then you can explain to the board why 3,000 tons of zero-point fuel is sitting in a locked bay while the government cancels your contracts," I fired back. Davis sighed, a brief flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He turned his head slowly and looked at Fletcher. Fletcher flinched. He wiped his sweaty palms on his pristine trousers. "Sir, the asset damaged company property. I was just following the depreciation protocols. You bypassed safety regulators in an attempt to silently terminate a union employee and a leased asset to cover up an extortion grievance," Davis corrected calmly. "Your sloppiness caused a wildcat strike, paralyzed our primary logistics hub, and destroyed a squad of private security. You are a liability, Fletcher." "Mr. Davis, please. I was just balancing the ledger." "You're fired, Fletcher," Davis said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry. It was just a calculation. The corporation was amputating a diseased finger to save the hand. "Your severance is void due to gross misconduct. Return your security clearance chip." Fletcher's mouth opened and closed. He looked at me, then at the massive, terrifying form of Tess looming in the shadows. He knew what happened to ex-corporate officers who ended up stranded on the lower decks without a bodyguard. He stripped the plastic badge from his lapel, his hands shaking violently, and dropped it on the floor. He turned and walked back into the elevator, alone. Davis looked back to me. "The hazard pay will be backdated to the start of the quarter. Asset 8 will be placed on a Tier 2 union contract. Are we operational, Foreman?" It wasn't a victory parade. There was no cheering. It was a cold, cynical boardroom deal made in a puddle of grease, but it was enough. "We're operational," I muttered. Davis nodded once, turned on his heel, and walked away. Over the next few hours, the station slowly bled back to life. The emergency lights faded, replaced by the standard clicking fluorescents. The cargo conveyors groaned, resetting their massive chains. The dock workers went back to their shifts, limping, bruised, but carrying their heads a fraction higher. I walked out to the edge of the docking bay, looking out through the massive reinforced plasteel window at the cold, indifferent expanse of stars. I pulled a crushed, unlit cigarette from my pocket and put it between my lips. Heavy, scraping footsteps approached from behind. The air grew warm. Tess sat beside me. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked out at the stars, a bruised, burned survivor of a world that viewed her as a machine. "The medical bay treated the hatchlings," she said finally, her translator humming softly. "They have antiparasitics. They have protein. They are sleeping warmly." "Good," I said, chewing on the filter. "Donovan put you on the manifest for Doc 4 tomorrow. Heavy lifting, less radiation." "I am a union asset now," she stated. It wasn't a question, but there was a strange inflection in the robotic voice, a subtle note of disbelief. "No," I corrected her, looking up at her massive, scarred face. "You're a dock worker, just another miserable human trying to earn a paycheck." "Welcome to the grind, Tess." She let out a low, vibrating rumble deep in her chest. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was soft, rhythmic, and warm. She was laughing. I smiled, a tired, genuine smile, and struck a match to light my cigarette. We stood there together in the quiet hum of the station, two imperfect, exhausted cogs in the machine, breathing in the scent of ozone and survival. Sometimes fighting the system isn't about becoming a hero. It's about holding the line so a mother can feed her kids. Logan and Tess survived the corporate meat grinder, proving that solidarity hits harder than any plasma rifle. If this grounded, gritty tale of human defiance and alien survival kept you hooked, punch that like